И Сергея прочесть. Давайте первый стих.
Да, хорошо. Я надеюсь, меня слышно ведь, да?
Да, прекрасно.
Да, замечательно. Kai ekusin ho basileus Herodes faneron garagenitot onem aftu, kai elegon hoti Ioannes ho baptizon egegertai eknekron, kai diatuta energusin, kai dynamais enafto.
Ну, давайте еще и 15 тоже прочтем. Продолжение того, что
Alloide elegon hoti Elias istin, alloide elegon hoti prophetes hos seiston propheton.
Спасибо. Ну, молва о происходящем дошла до царя Ирода, так как имя Иисуса приобрело известность. Люди говорили, это Иоанн Креститель воскрес из мертвых, и поэтому им совершаются чудеса. Другие говорили, что это Илья, третий, что пророк, как один из древних пророков. Но с точки зрения перевода, если останавливаться на каких-то моментах, где позволил себе относительно свободный перевод, буквально, конечно же, «Экусен губислеус Иродос» услышал царь Ирод, но мне кажется, что по-русски, тогда, когда речь идет не о слышании в таком физическом смысле слова, что человек преклоняет ухо свое, а когда речь идет вот о том, что какой-то слух доходит, то или слух доходит, либо молва дошла до царя Ирода. Да? Может быть, поскольку нужно делать фразу о происходящем эксплицитной, молва дошла до царя Ирода, так как имя Иисуса приобрело известность. Да? И люди говорили, опять же, мы здесь делаем более имплицитную информацию эксплицитной, люди говорили, это Иоанн Креститель воскрес из мертвых, и потому им совершает чудеса. Другие говорили, что это Илья, третий, что пророк, как один из древних пророков. Думаю, что здесь греческий артикль «он профетон» имеет смысл перевести как бы словом «древний», да? Потому что пророки, да, с определенным артиклем, это имеется в виду, конечно же, вот те пророки, корпус которых в этот момент уже был вполне определен внутри еврейской традиции. Если переходить от уровня отдельных слов и фраз к уровню смыслов, да, или к месту этого текста внутри Евангелия от Марка, то, как это часто бывает в Евангелии от Марка, у нас структура текста представляет собой некоторый такой сэндвич. Да? У нас Иисус посылает апостолов, признание 12, он посылает их апостолов, перекоп, который мы разбирали в прошлый раз. Этот перекоп будет продолжаться у нас, начиная с 30 стиха, да, апостолы собрались к Иисусу и стали ему рассказывать про все, что они делали, про все, как они ему учили. И вот внутри этого, казалось бы, непрерывного повествования у нас вставлен рассказ про Иоанна Крестителя, который как бы подготавливает то, что будет у нас чуть дальше, да? Вопрос про идентичность Иисуса и исповедание Петра. Потому что рассказ про смерть Иоанна Крестителя, он, собственно говоря, начинается с еще очередного постановки вопроса о том, кто таков Иисус, какова здесь природа тех чудес, которые он делает. Ну, вот, может быть, здесь, не знаю, вернулся к нам Джой. Джой, are you with us?
I'm here. Yes. Hello.
Okay. I wanted to draw our attention to the word phaneron and to the concept that is behind this. Throughout, it seems that throughout the gospel, we have, in some sense, a contrast between miracles that Jesus does in such a way that everyone can see it and his name becomes known, as we see it here, but at the same time, his identity is hidden. And it seems that this is very important mark, this contrast between things that are well known.
Minutes to do that. But I think Mark also has the sense that, you know, this gospel, it's not just a story of what happened to Jesus back in his lifetime, it's also a story of what's happening now. And so when Jesus performs a miracle and everybody sees it, that is a foreshadowing of what's happening in the present. You know, so I think it's not a consistent motif, but maybe the different strands of it are saying different things. So I don't know. I've talked a lot. So
Okay. So you think that this is rather not a single motive that goes through the whole gospel, contrasting these two topics of Jesus hidden, Jesus identity hidden, and Jesus identity revealed, but rather this is a result of combination of different traditions.
yes, and you can see that, you know, sometimes Jesus performs miracles and everybody sees them. Sometimes he performs miracles in secret. And I think sometimes he's imposed the notion of secrecy on a passage where it really doesn't make sense, but he has some sort of theological reason he's doing that. For example, I think it's at the end of this chapter, or you have, or in chapter 7, you have the story of the healing of Jairus's daughter, the head of the synagogue. And, you know, there's this big crowd there who have seen the synagogue ruler come and ask for healing of his daughters, saying, you know, his daughter is at the point of death. Jesus goes into his house and he raises her from the dead. And then he says, don't tell anybody. It doesn't make any sense because everybody has seen, you know, has heard that the girl has died. They're going to see her alive. How can it be secret? So I think that's an example of how sometimes, you know, he needs to impose secrecy on a story that beforehand didn't have secrecy in it. Понимаете?
Yes. The crucial question here is whether this contrast between secrecy on the one hand, messianic secret, and the explicit and revealed miracles, is it part of Mark's own plot, or whether this is the result of combination of different traditions that existed before Mark? So is it just by coincidence that these two things are in contrast throughout the gospel, or is it part of a deliberately created literary device by the author of the gospel?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I said before, I think probably sometimes it was there in the tradition, like these stories where Jesus takes the person out, heals them in secret. That's like other miracle workers. But I think sometimes it's something, as in the story of the Jairus's daughter, that he's added. So it's his conception, but he also wants to say something else, which sometimes contradicts it. So I think on the one hand, so here's the basic contradiction for Mark. He wants to say that Jesus was such a powerful figure that who he was couldn't help being apparent even in his lifetime. So it keeps bursting forward. That's the one thing he wants to say. But on the other hand, he wants to say that who he was couldn't really be revealed until his death and resurrection. So there has to be hiddenness during his lifetime. So, those are both important things for him to say, that there's a kind of economy to salvation. There's a history of salvation within Jesus' lifetime. But on the other hand, the story isn't just a narrative about what happened in Jesus' lifetime, but it's also a narrative about what's going on now.
Okay, thank you. I think we can return to the topic of Messianic secret later on. Probably it would be good if someone from our seminar takes upon himself or herself to make a small presentation this topic, which is probably
I'll make a PDF also of my appendix about it, and I'll send it. I'll send it to Maria, and you can distribute it to the group.
Okay. Thank you, Joel. So if there will be some volunteers who would like to make a kind of small presentation on the topic of Messianic secret in John, based both on Joel's excursus and on earlier literature, you can write to me or to Maria. Let's return back to our text. Один момент, one more moment that draws our attention here is that people were saying that Johannes the Baptist resurrected from the world of the dead, and that's the reason why high dynamis, чудеса, как мы в какой-то момент договорились переводить слово динамис, хотя, может, это не окончательное решение, но вроде бы лучшего решения мы не предложили. And that's the reason why he does miracles. In fact, in all four Gospels, we have John performing the act of baptism, but did not have any indications that John performed miracles.
Yeah, in fact, the Gospel of John, I think in the Gospel of John, they say John performed no miracles and contrasting it with Jesus.
Yes. So the idea that John, who lived before these events and was beheaded and hasn't done any miracles, now he is risen and performs miracles, seems at first glance a bit paradoxical, but probably the word kaidia tuto, energusin dynamics and naucho, which is inserted here as an explication why John, who hasn't performed any miracles while he was alive, now becomes a miracle maker, is somehow connected with the idea that the one who has passed through death and resurrection acquires new powers, and among them power to create, to do miracles, because both this dia tuto in the Greek text and the comparison of this sentence with the tradition that John didn't perform any miracles speak in favor of this idea. What do you think, Joel?
Yeah, I like that. And I think that for Mark, the miracles that Jesus performs, I mean, there's some connection between those miracles and his own death and resurrection. And especially, again, when we get to his raising dead girl to life. You know, the fact that the raising terminology is used, I think for a Christian reader would make them think of Jesus being raised from the dead. You know, so I think maybe the suggestion is that, you know, this is like Jesus' miracles in the gospel are a foreshadowing of the power that comes to him through his own death and resurrection. And again, it's not completely consistent because his death and resurrection hasn't happened yet, but it's a foretaste, it's a proleptic. I mean, if we can read a lot into what you know, these people are saying, it's just a common opinion that's being relayed here, and it might be right and it might be wrong. It might just be superstition, but I guess I think you're probably right that there's more to it than that.
Yes, because if this understanding, this picture that person after death and resurrection has more powers than during his own life, and John the Baptist is here portrayed, at least in the minds of the people who speak about him, as an example of this pattern, then shouldn't we regard this pattern as a hint to the whole story that lies behind the gospel, to Jesus' story, especially taking into account that in many other respects, John is here pictured as a forerunner of Jesus, and they both share the same fate of being killed, and their fate is even described by the same expression that they paradidoto, they were given
Mhm.
to their fate.
Yes, yes, certainly that John is the forerunner of Jesus, not just in preaching, but also in being killed, although he's innocent, so he's certainly, he's a pattern, though Jesus is greater than him. And, and I don't, I'd also point to just, the folklore in which, implements of execution sometimes have magic power, like we have some evidence that I think even nails that were used in crucifixion, were considered to be magic implements. So, this whole idea that power comes out of death, and even that it comes out of especially, the death of somebody who was executed, I think it has some roots in maybe in ancient magical beliefs. And of course, it's been Christianized in Christian circles.
Okay, thank you. I'll give a small summary in Russian. Мне показалось, что вот на этом моменте Иоанн Креститель воскрес из мертвых, и поэтому им совершаются чудеса. В контексте Евангелия от Марка стоило бы остановиться подробнее, потому что с первого взгляда может показаться, что это, там, не знаю, какое-то случайное утверждение, какие-то люди говорили, вот это какая-то суеверие, superstition, случайность, но, может быть, внутри контекста Евангелия от Марка это некоторый предваряющий намек на основную тему всего Евангелия. Да? Окей. Мы дочитали до 16 стиха. Ну, давайте прочтем 16 еще.
Так, да, и только его, да? Только 16.
Давайте.
Ακούσας δε ο Χερόδες έλεγεν «Ον εγώ αποκεφάλισα Ιωάννεν γούτος εγέρτχε».
Да. А Ирод, когда услышал, сказал, это Иоанн, которого я обезглавил, он воскрес. То есть Ирод тоже присоединяется к первому из изложенных выше мнений. И дальше это дает повод евангелисту ввести сюда, наверное, существовавшую отдельно Евангелие историю, сюда инкорпорированную, про смерть Иоанна Крестителя. Давайте, может, прочтем стихи с 17 по 20.
Хорошо. Αυτός γαργο Χερόδες απαστεύασε κράτησεν τον Ιωάνναν καί έδωσεν αυτόν εν φυλακέ δια Herodiada, ten γυναίκα Φιλίππου του αδελφού αυτού, ότι αυτήν εγάμεσεν. Έλεγεν γαργο Ιωάννας το Χερόδε, ότι ουκ έξιστην σι έχειν ten γυναίκα του αδελφού σου. Χεδε Χεροντιάς ενέχειν αυτό καί έθελεν αυτόν απακτείναι καί ουκ εδύνατα. Hogar Herodes εφοβέται τον Ιωάννεν εἰδώς αυτόν άντρα δίκαιον καί Άγιον καί συνεταίρει αυτόν καί ακούσας αυτού παλά επόρεϊ καί χεδέως αυτού έκουεν.
Спасибо. А ваша специализация ближе к византийскому или новогреческому, если я правильно понимаю?
Да, простите, я этим часто грешу тем, что я схожу на не совсем классическое чтение. Да, я собираюсь быть византинистом.
Хорошо, но Может, в любом случае, два разных произношения имеет смысл четко разделять друг от друга. Спасибо.
Да, простите еще раз.
Вот. Дело в том, что Ирод приказал схватить Иоанна, связать и посадить в тюрьму из-за Иродиады, жены брата своего Филиппа. Ирод женился на ней. Иоанн говорил Ироду: «Ты не можешь жить с женой собственного брата». Иродиада ненавидела Иоанна и хотела убить его, но не могла, потому что Ирод чтил Иоанна, зная его как человека праведного и святого, и оберегал его. Слушая Иоанна, Ирод приходил в замешательство, в полное замешательство, но ему нравилось слушать его. Это, честно говоря, вот и как читатель греческого текста, и как переводчик, я тоже немножко прихожу в замешательство, да, от этой фразы «кус ауту пола эпорой кай гедеус ауту экоэн». Давайте к ней вернемся чуть позже. Наверное, для тех, кто не сталкивался с комментариями к Евангелиям раньше, немножко сказать про эту историю и про то, что Ирод приказал схватить Иоанна и в конце концов приказал его убить, и про то, что Ирод женился на своей родственнице Иродиаде, родственнице одного из своих родственников, жене одного из своих родственников, и это вызывало в народе недовольство. Мы знаем из внебиблейских источников, скажем, из Иосифа Флавия. Если память не изменяет, генеалогия тех самых Иродов, она очень запутанная. Там вот здесь была какая-то допущена Марком ошибка. Иродиада, на которой женился Ирод Антипа, действительно была женой одного из... Сама была его родственницей, одновременно женой одного из его родственников, но, кажется, не Филиппа, брата своего. Joel, am I right that Herodias, the lady who is mentioned here, was really a relative of Herodes Agrippa, and the wife of one of his relatives, but that the name Filippo to Adelphoto was put here wrongly by the gospel writer.
I can't remember all the details. The one thing that I remember is that Philip was, I think he's the half brother of Herod.
Yes.
Not the full brother, yeah. So, and that, and I don't think it's clear if that marital relation is forbidden in the Bible itself, but in later Jewish law, it is forbidden, marriage with the half brother. That's what I remember. I mean, the Herod family tree is very complicated because there was a lot of intermarriage, within the family. But I don't remember all the details now, even though I wrote a whole book on John the Baptist. So that's my bad, as we say.
Yes, the whole family tree is very complicated, both because there were a lot of intermarriages and a lot of divorces.
And there's a lot of people named Herod too, by the way. So.
But what is important for us here is that this is probably not just a historian's note, but rather a popular legend that came to the gospel writer through some kind of folklore.
Yes, well, of course, yeah, I mean, and one way you can see that is comparing the gospel accounts with Josephus, who has a much more realpolitik kind of description. And also our gospel account, it echoes biblical narratives, and especially the Esther story, where the king promises up to half of his kingdom for his wife, and the same phrase occurs here. This and the other thing that's we'll probably get to this, but the other difference that's significant is in Josephus, Herod wants to kill John because he perceives him to be a threat, a political threat, because all these people are listening to him. And so he decides to kill him in order to prevent a revolt. In Mark, at least, he doesn't want to kill him. He arrests him because he's creating this trouble about Herod's Antipas's marriage, but he likes to listen to him and he wants to guard him, and he's only manipulated into killing him by these women, scheming women. So there's a contradiction there. And Josephus's version is supported by Matthew, because Matthew also talks about how, even though Matthew is basically following Mark, he also slips in this thing about how Herod wanted to kill Jesus, but he was afraid to because the crowd was on his side. So I think I agree with you that there's, Mark's story has some historical core, but it's been embellished with some elements, partly from biblical tradition.
It was not only embellished, it was significantly changed, because if Herodes Antipas killed John for political reason, that's one thing. If he was innocent, or at least he tried to be innocent, he was to some extent himself a victim of this plot of two virtuous women.
Yes, I agree that it's a stark.
He's somehow acquitted of the guilt.
Well, yes.
Why?
And in that way, he's quite similar to Pontius Pilate.
Yes.
Right? That he also, I think there also the gospel narrative has made this ruler seem more righteous and more sympathetic than he probably was historically. And in both cases, I think, it goes back to what we were talking about before. Jesus was such a great person, that even rulers who should have been opposed to him didn't want to kill him and had to be manipulated into doing that. I'd see that as a theological embellishment or motif in the case of both Pilate and Herod. The one thing I'd say in defense of Mark's historicity, though, is, if John did challenge, the legitimacy of Herod's marriage, that would have been a serious thing. And you just think of, in societies today that have kind of puritanical governments, like some of the, like Saudi Arabia, places like that embrace a very puritanical religion. If you say something about the ruler's marriage and imply that it's legitimate, that's serious, and that is even like a political transgression. So the line between, this kind of soap opera, marriage stuff and the political can become blurred.
Yes. Can we say that from the point of view of real history, what happened there? There was just realpolitik and political cynicism and political pragmatism that caused Herodes to order the execution of John the Baptist. But somehow the gospel writer wants to shift the blame from the rural to some other forces, maybe because this reference to realpolitik and political cynicism would be too prosaic. Just that's what happens. And here, in some sense, these two women are depicted, though this is not stated clearly, as a kind of puppets that play in the hands of demonic powers. And in this case, the parallel that you have drawn between this story and the treatment of the figure of Pontius Pilatus in Mark becomes even more prominent. Once again, probably in reality, Pontius Pilatus has ordered the execution of Jesus because of political reasons, realpolitik, and cynicism, and so on. But once again, Mark tries to shift the guilt from him, probably not because Mark had some particular sympathy towards Herodes or Pontius Pilatus, but because this shifting of guilt from the decision maker to some other people and forces that manipulate him goes well with his overall idea that both John the Baptist and Jesus are not just victims of some political events, but some forces develop specific plots to destroy them, so that even political leaders become just puppets in the hands of women or demonic Jews who try to manipulate them.
Yes, I agree with that entirely, and I think it relates to a verse later in the Gospel, chapter 10, verse 42. Oidate hoti hoidokuntes archein ton ethnon. You know that those who seem to rule the nations. And
Excuse me. Wait a second. I must leave for a second. То есть какие-то возникли люди, которые хотели с нами поговорить из соседнего подъезда. Let's turn back to the topic that we were discussing, namely the role of the rulers. That's the text Joe was speaking about. Hoi docuntes archeit ton etnon. Опять же, когда мы так вот бегло читаем эти слова, Иисус, подозвав их, мысли учеников своих, сказал им: вы знаете, что почитающиеся князьями народов или владыками народов над ними господствуют. Можно вот это гойдокунтес, почитающиеся, считать, может быть, некоторой такой иронией в адрес больших людей, которые слишком много про себя думают. Но, возможно, Джоэль здесь прав, что вот эти докунтес — это не какой-то случайный элемент, опять же, кусок большой теологии Марка, да, что вот эти самые люди, которые мнят себя, что они архейн, тон это но, что они правят народами, на самом деле являются всего лишь орудиями в руках тех самых демонических сил, о которых мы говорим, которые могут здесь действовать либо через вот, еврейских первосвященников, которые предают Иисусу Пилату, либо вот здесь через женщин, которые заставляют буквально Ирода Агриппу казнить Иоанна Крестителя. У нас, я понимаю, что это очень неполиткорректно в современном мире, но с точки зрения еврейской ментальности, еврейской традиции, Раби Жаэр, женщина здесь часто выступает как некий такой агент, который соблазняет человека и вводит его в грех. То есть здесь появление, то, что вина сдвигается с Ирода Антипы на окружающих его женщин, это тоже некий такой шаг в сторону того, чтобы в конце концов представить и его, а дальше и этих женщин такими вот марионетками в руках тех сил, что движут миром и движут этим сюжетом. As usual, I just have shown the passage that you referred to and made a small comment on this. What can I say about the last two lines of this verse? Kai acusas autu polla eporei. On the one hand. On the other hand, kai hedeus autu equen. On the one hand, he was very pleased to hear him, but on the other hand, he was at a complete loss hearing this.
Yeah, and he perceives that he is an andra dikaion, kaihagion. So even this, king who is going to execute him, and this is also similar to Jesus, Pilatus, he knows that Jesus is dikaios, that he's innocent. But yeah, I like this combination. It seems in a somewhat unrealistic story, this seems realistic to me. That he's struck by him. He doesn't know what to make of him, and yet he hears him gladly. He perceives, I guess, again, it's a matter of Jesus' charismatic power, right? He perceives that it doesn't fit into his normal way of thinking. It confuses him, and yet the power is there, and he wants to hear more about it. He wants to listen to Jesus more, and he wants to protect him. So, Jesus has this power that, even some people who we would consider bad people, they can't help but observe that power, though it doesn't fit into their normal categories.
Yes, so in this perspective, these conversations between John the Baptist and Herodes Agrippa also somehow resembles and becomes a forerunner of the short dialogue between Jesus and Pilatus, Pontius Pilatus, in Mark 15.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, one thing I'd add, just in terms of the gospel comparisons, is, I mean, I think already in Mark, Pilate is a pretty sympathetic figure. As you get to later and later gospels, he becomes even more sympathetic, more on Jesus' side than he is in Mark, and less guilty, and the Jews become more guilty. So I think you can see a progression there. And that probably relates to the changing settings of these gospels. But I think the motif is already there in Mark, but it's developed further by the later gospels, especially Matthew and John.
Yeah, so we can say that the dialogue between Jews and Pontius Pilatus, the relationship between Jews and Pontius Pilatus in Matthew and John, are somehow even closer to the relationship, to the plot of what happened between John the Baptist and Herodes Antipas than this parallelism is in Mark.
It's developed further, yeah.
Developed further, but it's still there already in Mark, but later it develops so that in some sense this parallelism with the death of John the Baptist becomes more evident in Matthew, for example.
Yeah, yes. So yeah. Because Pilate says, I'm not guilty, and he washes his hands, and he's warned by his wife, don't have anything to do with this righteous man. So but it's already there in the seed in Mark. It's already there in Mark. And it's already, I would say, not strictly historical in Mark, and it becomes even less historical in Matthew. Because, again, what we know from Josephus about Pontius Pilate is he didn't think twice about executing lots of people, especially during Passover.
Yes. And one more story that you can draw here for comparison is the fate of Apostle Paul. Because once again, we read that when Paul was arrested by the Roman powers, the guilt for his being arrested and sent to Rome, where according to the biblical tradition, he was finally executed. The guilt was also moved from the real decision makers, like Felix or Fest, to the Jews who accused Paul before them.
Yeah, I agree with that. Though, the only biblical tradition you have about that is in Acts. And the book of Acts does make the Jews the primary movers against Paul rather than the Romans. But on the other hand, even, at the end of Acts, in the last chapter, I think what it shows is a divided Israel, right? Some listen to Paul happily, heideos, and some oppose. And the book ends, without narrating Paul's execution. So what you're left with is a picture of an Israel that's divided over Paul and over the story of Jesus.
Yes, we can look at some places in Acts which bring the story of Paul into the picture. Wait a second. Yes, that's Paul and Felix. Felix even comes with his wife and comes to hear what Paul was saying about Jesus Christ. And obviously, he seems to be quite interested in what Paul was saying, because he even takes his wife with him. And even you see that Felix Amphibus Genomenos, he was even somehow, what would be the right word here? He was frightened, or he was revering, trembled, as King James Version puts here. And this once again resembles what we read here about Herodes and John.
Yes, I think that's right. And people have have shown that there are very far-reaching parallels between what happens to Jesus in Luke's gospel and what happens to Peter and Paul and the other apostles in the book of Acts. And sometimes even just literary connections, so that parallel is so. I think what is happening in Acts, and we talked about this before, the Gospel of Luke is just the beginning of the story of what Jesus said and did and how people reacted to him. And the book of Acts continues the story. Jesus continues to act and to be reacted to, but now he's working through Paul and Peter and the other disciples.
Yes, exactly. Wait a second. You see that even on the level of words, we see here in Mark that Herodes forbade ton Ioannen, while we see in Acts that Felix amphibos genomenos, and also we see, for example, in the Gospels that when Pontius Pilatus heard that Jesus was perceived by some people as a son of God, he was also frightened. So there is a parallelism between the fate of John and Herodes, the fate of Jesus and Pilatus, the fate of Paul and Felix.
But Felix has a nicer wife. Right.
Yes, but also we know that Pontius Pilatus had a very nice wife, very benevolent.
That's true in Matthew, yeah.
In Matthew, yes.
Mhm.
So can we say that here it seems we have more or less not the same plot, but rather the same model for plots that is exemplified in the stories about John the Baptist, in the Gospels about Jesus, and in the story in Acts about Paul.
Yes, I think so. And there is, there's a political dimension to this, especially the story about Pilate and the Roman rulers in Acts, the story that's presented in Acts is these Jewish leaders or Jewish people keep making trouble. They keep accusing the Christians of being revolutionaries, but every time the Roman leaders look into it, they realize they're innocent. And, we know that Christians were suspected of being some sort of insurrectionists or, some sort of subversive people. And so I think that, partly what these narratives are doing is showing, look, even the rulers, when they really looked into it, when they really got to know John the Baptist or Jesus or Jesus's disciples, they realized that these charges were wrong. So it's partly an apologia about whether or not the Christians were revolutionaries.
Yes. That's another dimension. What I would like to show is the relevant passage from the Gospels. When Pilatus heard that Jesus was believed to be, Jesus was saying about himself he was the Son of God, he malon forbade. So even on the level of lexics, the three stories have the same lexicon, and then the same plot that finally, driven by external forces, by malevolent women, or Jewish archpriests Pilatus and Felix and Herodes had to betray the righteous people that were in their custody.
Yeah, and I think Pilate goes on in this passage in John to say, the one who has handed you over to me has the greater guilt. So Pilate isn't guilty, it's these manipulative Jews.
Yes, that's John 19:11, где тут ho paradus messoi meidzena hamartien echei. But that's the same verb paradidomi that is used in Mark, both regard to John the Baptist and with regard to Jesus.
Yeah, and it's also used in chapter 13 for the disciples. Their prophecy that you will be paradidotai, to the authorities. So there's three stages. John the Baptist preaches and is handed over. Jesus preaches and is handed over, and then the disciples will preach and they will be handed over. And I'm sure that's a deliberate parallel that's being made on all three levels. John the Baptist is the forerunner and the disciples are the post runners.
Yes, and here we have the same verb in Acts used with regard to Paul. Oiodai paradosusim, eis heres et non. Just like in the case of the death of Jesus, according to the gospel narrative, it was not Romans, not the ethnoi themselves, but the Jews who handed Jesus over to these ethnoi.
But there's one other dimension I think it's important, maybe, and that's that same verb, paradidomai, is used in the Septuagint of Isaiah chapter 53, right? He was handed over to suffering and death. Of the Lord's servant.
Yes, right? I have just brought it to our screen. Yes, Anton paradote eis thanatum hepsycheutu.
So I guess, kind of the theological question is, who's doing the handing over? Is it just these human beings? Or is it also, these demonic powers that stand behind the human beings? Or ultimately, is it not God? Because I think the sense that you get from Isaiah 53 is that God is ultimately responsible for this suffering and redemptive death of the Eved Adonai.
Yes, exactly. Очень часто видим действительно, особенно в повествовании Марка, что про Иоанна Крестителя, про Иисуса говорится, что они были преданы на смерть, да? Вот преданы язычникам, но это образ, который встает за этой картинкой, он получается каким-то таким очень многозначным, да? С одной стороны, как бы казнь Иисуса, распоряжение дает Понтий Пилат, казнь Иоанна Крестителя, распоряжение о казни отдает Ирод Антипа. В случае апостола Павла его в Рим посылают римские прокураторы, но эти прокураторы цари, наместники, они оказываются марионетками в руках, в одном случае, своей жены, в другом случае, еврейских первосвященников или обвинителей Павла, а те, в свою очередь, оказываются марионетками в руках демонических сил, которые за ними стоят, но в конечном счете и за демоническими силами тоже стоит воля Бога, марионетками которого оказываются, в свою очередь, демонические силы. Вот, по-видимому, такая многоярусная картина, если настает, она восходит, вот как справедливо отметил Джоэль, в некоторых местах, по крайней мере, тому, как воспринимались в это время знаменитые пророчества пророка Исаии о рабе Господнем. Вот. Но здесь у нас, как это мы очень часто видим в библейских повествованиях, как бы некоторая теологическая картина накладывается на рассказ о том, что происходило в истории, и рассказ о том, что происходило в истории, он оказывается под очень сильным влиянием, переинтерпретирован вот этой накладывающейся на него теологической матрицей. Ну, давайте вернемся к самому рассказу. Мы все пока что говорили про то, что здесь и почему происходило, но сам этот рассказ еще не читали. Давайте к нему вернемся. У нас еще есть немножко времени. Давайте, может быть, тогда уже не останавливались на каких-то мелочах, но все же прочтем вот следующий перекоп. У нас есть чтец.
Да, да. То есть мы доходим до Легуса, или там еще текст? Да, там еще текст.
Давайте, может быть, вот до конца 24 стиха.
Угу, хорошо. Kai genomenes chimeras eucairum, вот Herodes, то есть genesios autu deipnon nepoiesen, то есть megistasin autu, kai то есть hiliarchos, kai то есть protois tes Galalaias, kai eselthuses tes Gatros autu Herodiados, kai orchesamenes eresento Herode, kai to есть synonankeimenois, Eipen ho Basileus to Curasiu, aiteson me ho eantheles, kai dosusoi, kai omasen aute palla hoti, простите, hoti ean me aiteses dosusoi heos chemisus tes Basileiasmo, kai exelthus eipen te metriautes tiaitesomai.
Представился удобный день, когда Ирод по случаю своего рождения устроил пир для своих вельмож, тысячи начальников и первых людей Галилеи. Вошла дочь Ирода, Иродиада, и танцевала, и так понравилось Ироду его гостям, что царь сказал девочке: «Проси у меня, что хочешь, я дам тебе». И он поклялся: «Все, чего не попросишь, дам тебе хоть полцарства моего». Она пошла и говорит матери, чтобы просить, так говорит, голову Иоанна Крестителя. Ну, давайте тогда дочитаем эту историю до конца, чтобы нам в следующий раз начать уже с новой перекопы. Тогда 25-29.
Хорошо. Εισελθούς ευλθούς μετασπουδές προς τον βασιλέα ετέσα το λέγουσα, έλογιν εξαουτές δόσμο επί πίνακι τεν κεφαλέν Ιωάννου του Βαπτιστού. Καί περίληπος γινόμενος ο βασιλέος δια τους χόρκους καί τους ανακειμένους ουκ ετχέλεσεν αθετέσει, αουτέν. Kai euthius apastenes co Basileus speculatoro epetaxen enen kai ten kefalen autu, kai apelton apekefalisen auton en teflake. Kai enon ten kefalen autu epipinekin, kai eduken auten to corasio, kai to corasion eduken auten temetri autes. Kai accusantes masetai autu elson kai eranto ptomo autu kai esekan auto en nemio.
Девочка тотчас спешно идет к царю и просит. Помните наша знаменитая тотчас марковская Эвтюс. Я хочу, чтобы ты подал мне прямо сейчас на блюде голову Иоанна Крестителя. Царь опечалился, но раз уж была клятва, притом перед гостями, он не стал отказывать ей. Тотчас царь послал палача, приказав принести голову Иоанна. Палач пошел и обезглавил Иоанна в тюрьме. А отрубленную голову принес на блюде и подал девочке, а девочка отдала ее своей матери. Ученики Иоанна, услышав об этом, пришли, забрали тело и положили его в гробницу. Вот мы быстро прочитали эту перекопу. Если еще вот в остающееся у нас время есть вопросы какие-то по этой перекопе или комментарии. John, would you like to add some comments on the history itself?
Well, the only thing I think I can say historically is I don't think Jews regularly had birthday parties in antiquity. So the fact that, he's having a birthday party, it's part of this image of him as kind of a not a very good Jew. And other than that, no, I would have more to say about the theology of what's happening, but but that would be a longer story.
Okay, then probably we should start our next meeting with this longer story.
Good idea.
Okay, so next time we continue with the story of John the Baptist and Herodes Antipas.
It's an exciting story. It really, I don't know if, do you have on your television the genre we call soap opera? Very dramatic stories about family intrigues.
Yes, we have the same expression in Russia, мыльная опера.
Yeah, well, this is a real soap opera with biblical echoes.
Yes.
A biblical soap opera. We can talk about it more next time.
Okay. Мне кажется, что сегодня мы, на самом деле, очень интересные какие-то здесь вещи увидели, насколько у нас здесь в библейском повествовании, если вот не просто быстро его прочесть, а вот в рамках нашего медленного чтения задерживаться над тем, какие тут есть у нас параллели на уровне слов, на уровне сюжетов, или одновременно на уровне слов и на уровне сюжетов, то у нас выстраивается какое-то такое более объемное понимание всех этих текстов, как друг к другу отсылающих, перекликающихся. И как получается, что на разных уровнях рассказывающих одну и ту же историю. Да? По крайней мере, таков явно был, может быть, осознанный, может быть, подсознательный, но выбор библейских авторов. Спасибо всем, кто с нами был сегодня.
Спасибо.
See you.
Спасибо.
Bye.
До свидания.
Cheers.
Спасибо.